Hello, so today we're going to be talking about the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a, no pun intended, but common AP environmental science topic that we should get to know and familiarize ourselves with. It does not, well, it's not as intimidating as you might think. The defining of it is a little bit harsh. But once we get into some investigations and examples, you'll kind of learn to understand it a bit more. So defining tragedy of the commons, essentially we know Earth is made up of many finite resources, which can be referred to as non-renewables, non-renewable resources. Apologies if I misspell any words. Despite English being my first language, I still cannot spell correctly. All right, so non-renewable resources, but we also have some resources that tread the line, right? We have some resources that tread the line between renewable and non-renewable. Things like groundwater, aquifers, things like that, right? So this is technically renewable if we give it time for water to seep through the soil and start rebuilding the supply. However, if we use it at a higher rate than it gets replenished, it turns into a non-renewable resource. We cannot replenish it fast enough. So eventually it will be depleted to the point where nobody can use it anymore. In defining tragedy of the commons, this would be where some individuals' use of this resource ruins the resource, either by depleting it, lowering population, or excess pollution. So three ways individuals ruin resources. I know this is a fun topic so far. All right, so we got that depletion. And this is the one we're going to really be looking at today in our example. We have lowering population, and then excess pollution. Can all of these go together, and can there be more? Yes, these are just examples of three ways that individuals can end up ruining resources, thus leading to the tragedy of the commons. This is supposed to be a common resource for all to use, but if one person uses it more than they're supposed to, or again, pollutes it, etc., then it ruins it for all. So that is essentially the theme around tragedy of the commons. All right, so an example scenario. Let's say we have a large-scale farm that produces fruit for 3 million people in the state of Kansas recently had the community pointing fingers to their agricultural practices. All of this was as a result of an environmental report that came out showing the groundwater being used by the community was contaminated with too much nitrogen. Let me get a different color here. Can I get a different color? Apparently not. All right. Too much nitrogen. There we go. All right. So let's say our first question here, again, thinking of tragedy of the commons, we want to discuss factors. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is factors from all points of view that could lead to an abundance of nitrogen in the groundwater. So all points of view, first things first, we know this farm is here and it's producing fruit. We can maybe assume maybe they're using chemicals, and those chemicals are seeping down into our groundwater. So perhaps one point of view could be that the farm is using too many fertilizers. All right, that's one point of view. Another point of view could be people. The people in the community are over-fertilizing their lawns. So people over-fertilizing their lawns. Maybe it's not the full large-scale farm. Perhaps the community sewer could not be working properly, so sewer issues within the city could be leading to, some type of contaminant seeping through the ground. Other things, we have industrial waste. Is there an industrial company around here? A high amount of livestock waste. We are in Kansas. Perhaps they have other agriculture practices going on. We don't know. So we have to come up with all points of views that could be leading to this abundance of nitrogen without pointing the finger first towards any one source. All right, so the next part to this says, number 2, during an extra investigation, it was found that the farm uses synthetic fertilizers on their crops, which are right above the aquifer. Discuss strategies to mitigate the use of synthetic fertilizers. What regulations, if any, would you recommend implementing so the groundwater becomes usable again? Would you recommend any legislation to protecting the aquifer? Why or why not? This also can go back to some legislation that it's important to know for AP Environmental Science. So as a note, groundwater, specifically groundwater, is not protected by the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act. All right. So Clean Water Act is something that we should know if we are going into the AP Environmental Science test. It is part of their required legislation that you know. One of the exceptions is that it does not directly talk about groundwater. Okay. So any regulations that we would have to make would have to be separate in this case, in this specific area, this jurisdiction. So, a couple things here. Again, we have lots of points of view that we can come from to kind of help out, these mitigating these synthetic fertilizers. Again, do we know exactly it's coming from the farm or all of it's coming from the farm? No. But we do have reports that some of it, at least, is coming from the farm. We have synthetic fertilizers being used there. We know it's a large-scale farm. It would make sense. So a couple of things could, start with the farm, fining the farm, potentially. If it overuses fertilizers, they can be held responsible. These corporations and companies can be held responsible if it is, in fact, polluting. In the community, we could pass legislation to restrict fertilizers use in the community. We could try to get the community to stop using these fertilizers. We could hire to clean the groundwater. Now, sometimes if groundwater, there's certain things where we can't always clean it, but there's sometimes you can. And then also we could produce legislation to maybe limit the groundwater in the area to only individuals and not large-scale operations. Large-scale operations. So these are just a few ideas. Are there others out there? Of course. If you have any extra ideas, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Please leave them there so we can have a good discussion about them. But yeah, so these are just some examples of extra legislation that could be done to mitigate increasing these synthetic fertilizers in the groundwater. All right, so third part to this, it says a year later, the environmental report comes out again. The levels have increased again. There is a proposal to use community funds to clean up the excess nitrogen in the water by raising taxes in the area. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of this proposal. What other alternatives could the community utilize? Again, lots of, points of views that we could take for this. A couple of answers that we could, use. Let's look at some, let me get a better color here. Let's look at the advantages. Advantages first for this. All right, so we're using community funds to clean this up. Water becomes usable again. So water becomes usable. All right. That's kind of the easy one. We spend the money, we clean it up, it's usable again. Advantages, the health issues are now not needed. Drinking nitrogen, not very good for us. So the health issues that come from drinking nitrogen are gone. So health issues from contaminated water, gone. And then potentially, if the community pays for this out of tax dollars, that could mean that the large-scale company would stay, right? If we're not asking them for the money, perhaps they're going to stay and keep the jobs in the community. So, company is less likely to move, keeping jobs. All right. So those are just some advantages. If you have others, again, please leave them in the comments and we can have a discussion about them. Love all different points of views, so make sure you add those. All right, so disadvantages. Disadvantages, things that are not so great from this legislation. Well, one, the community has to pay for it, and this is potentially paying for the company, the large-scale fruit company, their misuse of fertilizers. So maybe it wasn't a community problem, but now it's being put onto the community. So the community pays for corporation issues, essentially. We'll put that over here, actually. Corporation misuse of fertilizers. All right. Disadvantages, it could happen again in the future. So just because the community cleans it up doesn't mean it won't happen again. So could happen again. Could happen again. What are other alternatives that the community could utilize? Well, they could ask the farm to pay for a portion of the cleanup or all of the cleanup, depending on the amount that they do see the corporation putting into the groundwater. That could lead to some issues later on, but that is an option or an alternative that the community could utilize. All right, and the last part to this investigation says, predict future outcomes if tragedy of the commons continues in this community. What other resources could this affect? What are the pros and cons of letting the large-scale farm continue practices as normal in the community? Okay, so a couple of parts to this. So predictions. Predictions first. So if tragedy of the commons, if this one company is overusing, polluting this resource, the groundwater will continue to be polluted. So groundwater will continue to be polluted. That's just, if nothing changes, that's just going to be our trend that's going to appear. It could also potentially spread to other water resources. So let's say they stop maybe just putting it on the ground, and they decide, okay, well, let's, they don't want us putting it into the groundwater. Maybe we put it into this river, into this lake, etc. It could spread to other water resources, and the community could stop having access to any water in general. So then, what are the pros and cons of letting the large-scale farm continue practices as normal in the community? All right, so pros. Again, pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages, take your pick. We're kind of talking about the same thing here. If they are allowed, business is likely to stay. So this is, a pretty big company, it seems like, in the area. Jobs will stay. No one will get hurt in that regard. Good for the economy. They'll probably have food available, if they're growing resources in the city. That city should have food available. And then eventually the farm may offer to clean up, may offer to pay some of the damages. But it's not a guarantee, right? All right, so then cons. Cons with letting this large-scale farm continue practices as normal. The farm may not pay to clean up. So the farm may not pay to clean up. All right, so they may not. It could be a pro, could be a con. All access could be gone eventually. So all access to groundwater could be gone eventually. All right, so if they're continuing with this, there could come a point where we do not have the ability to clean up this groundwater anymore. It is too far gone. Maybe there's too little of it. There's too many pollutants. Whatever the issue may be, it would be, that resource essentially would be gone for everyone, which at that point could, again, lead to that business maybe not staying, maybe moving on, finding a different place. So, all answers is very open-ended. So if you have any alternative answers, I'd love to hear them. If you have any questions about this investigation or tragedy of the commons, leave them in the comments and subscribe for more educational videos like this one. Happy sciencing, everyone. Bye.